Thank you for coming to this forum series. It's our great pleasure to start a new forum series on AI plus X. We are committee members from Computer Science School of Computing, and we started this discussion a long time ago, and we wanted to talk about everything around the AI because we are the School of Computing. As all the members, we are building technologies for AI, and we are really interested in how our technology gets through the society and gets used and gets discussed. So this is our very first forum series, and I would like to introduce our forum committee members. Our committee chair is Professor Sung-Hyun Meng, who will shortly give a hello message. And our committee members are Alice Oh, Joo-ho Kim, Jae-hyuk Ha, and we have a new member, Soo Moon, and myself, Mi-young Cha. And we have a temporary web page, but for our next forum series, you will be able to find our web link on the email notice, and all the talks and the questions today will be recorded and will be made available on this web page. And we will share the final web link from our next announcement of this AI forum series. So let's welcome Professor Sung-Hyun Meng for his welcome message.
Okay, welcome to this inaugural session for AI plus X forum. My name is Sung-Hyun Meng. I'm a computer science professor on the School of Computing. And so this is a forum for AI plus X, and you probably know what AI means, but what is X? X actually is people like you who are participating in this forum. So X, you as an individual, or you kind of representing your own discipline. Maybe I'm the one of the few people here in this room who has understood some long history of AI or artificial intelligence. And AI, the term was coined in 1955 by John McCarthy at the Stanford University. And so AI has more than 65 years of history. AI has been a subfield of computer science, and to me, AI has been providing a lot of new interesting computational models in order to solve very tough problems. So in the history of AI, several other disciplines have been collaborating, such as cognitive science and psychology, linguistics, and neurosciences, and also even philosophy. These days, AI in general, or machine learning and deep learning in particular, have made AI move into center stage of computer science. Here you're trying to see the collaboration between AI and other disciplines and also industries. We like to see all the interactions and collaborations. And I think the relationship between AI and X are reciprocal in the sense that on the one hand, we're trying to see how we can help other disciplines for their own development using AI. But on the other hand, we also like to see what kind of problems need to be solved in different disciplines so that we can develop AI technology further. And we also have to think about avoiding some catastrophic side effect of technology development. So again, I like to see, or what we like to see, a lot of interactions between computer scientists or AI researchers and people in different academic disciplines and industries. So we hope that this AI plus X forum initiated by School of Computing can provide an arena where we see lots of discussions and lectures and collaborations, and we hope that we can nurture all those activities. Thank you.
I'm going to just talk briefly, but I still have to hold these two microphones. So thank you, Professor Meng, and also Professor Cha for this wonderful introduction. I think we all want to get right into the content of today's talks, so I will just briefly introduce the two speakers. Let me first introduce our first speaker, who is our own faculty member here at KAIST, but not in School of Computing. It's Professor So-Young Kim, and she is an expert in policy for science and technology. So she has been working in this field for a long time, and she has made a lot of impact and progress in talking about how our government and other governments can work with science and technology developers and researchers in collaborating together and making policy that can embrace and further develop our technologies for the good of the society. And Professor Kim has written a lot of newspaper articles, held a lot of discussions, and led various forums for this important discussion. And today we are honored to have her at this. I invited her at the last minute, but she has graciously agreed to be a speaker. So I would like to introduce Professor So-Young Kim.
As Professor Oh pointed out, this was a last-minute invitation, so I was expecting very, very casual discussion and presentation, and in particular, computer science. Computing people usually wear very casual style clothes, expecting everybody was wearing turtleneck. But then I just realized the next speaker, who is one of my very close friends, is wearing full business attire. Makes me a little bit confusing, okay? Anyway, so just 40-minute discussion. I wonder how I can really deliver all the things I have prepared. But let me just go anyway one by one. So how did I come to be involved in this AI plus X, essentially? Myself being one of the members in this X group, not necessarily meaning that I'm on X generation, because I don't have even a smartphone. So it's very, very hypocritical for someone to say something about computer technology or AI. But anyway, so how all this began, all meaning my interest in AI and other broad fields of computing technologies. I was reading this book just a couple of years before the 2016 AlphaGo shock. I was sitting in a hostel in Seattle, and then just happened to find this book, not because I was interested in philosophy, but just because this book was only 2 cents or 20 cents in a used bookstore I happened to come across. So I picked up this book and starting to read, and it was so interesting. It was not really very high level philosophical discussion, but rather very mundane discussion about how we live, how we could become just too human. Interesting question. But then the next one, 2009, some of you probably have seen this book and read this book, and it's already maybe 4th or 5th edition. And the challenge was, I wonder whether this would work, but later I like you to just check the name of this book and then see the video. It's actually about some linguist who was trying to win what's called the most human award, accompanying this Turing test. So they award the most human computer prize, but there is another prize which is relatively less known, which the name is Most Human. The challenge was it was so difficult to prove that he was a human, right? It was much easier to prove that he was a computer. So that was an interesting question, linking these two books. But then now the question is what it means to be a human, right? And here you see a big difference, which is we usually think of ourselves as just humans living everyday life, getting married and making friends and becoming some career women. But then at some point you realize whether this is a so common experience for everybody else, simply starting to think we are just individuals, but not individuals living far away from the earth, but rather really on some secular environment where we interact constantly with not only other individuals, but all kinds of institutions and policies, being affected some common decisions, which is really touching my own disciplinary identity, which is a political scientist. So I was thinking very seriously, there's something here, and this is the picture taken in just Christmas Eve in 1968, just a year before the famous Apollo moon landing. And this is the one of the 100 times, I guess, most famous and iconic pictures, photos taken in human history, just because this is the first time humans really found Earth really visually was round. And later on, some technicians put some color on the Earth. Initially, the picture was just like this, gray and white, so little white and then black. But this was really the beginning of the realization that we live in this common environment on Earth. So we cannot just remain human, but somehow we should be thinking about just human, right? What it means to be human. And then I really like this story. So the next year, July 20th, 1969, we saw the first man landing moon. So he was the first human on the moon. And so I was thinking about what it means to be human anyway. So here on Earth in small character anyway, right? But then suddenly, this is one of my other interests, what it means to be a human, anyway, on this great planet. So anyway, so many linkages. Then it came March 2016. Have you seen this picture, this documentary? Some of you? Oh, it's just very short, so I'll just show. It's so interesting, created by, I guess, in collaboration with DeepMind.
Go is the world's oldest continuously played board game. It is one of the simplest and also most abstract.
Beating a professional player at Go is a long-standing challenge of artificial intelligence.
Everything we've ever tried in AI just falls over when you try the game of Go.
The number of possible configurations of the board is more than the number of atoms in the universe.
AlphaGo found a way to learn how to play Go.
So far, AlphaGo has beaten every challenge we've given it, but we won't know its true strength until we play somebody who is at the top of the world, like Lee Sedol.
A match like no other is about to get underway in South Korea.
Lee Sedol is to Go what Roger Federer is to tennis.
Just the very thought of a machine playing a human is inherently intriguing.
The place is a madhouse.
Welcome to the DeepMind Challenge.
The whole world is watching.
Can Lee Sedol find AlphaGo's weakness? Whoa. Is there, in fact, a weakness?
The game kind of turned on its axis.
Well, look at his face.
That is not a confident face.
It's developing into a very, very dangerous fight.
Ooh, hold the phone. Lee has left the room.
In the end, it is about pride.
I think there's something went wrong.
Yeah, it's made a mistake.
He's got to pronounce America.
These ideas that are driving AlphaGo are going to drive our future.
This is it, folks.
Anyway, AlphaGo is something to me, somehow. Let me explain later. But so right after this first match, the famous professor here from computer science, wrote this article. The next day, again, I contributed my own article. And then just the very, very next day, there was the first concern about something that may go wrong, right? So I have been organizing several workshops. Of course, I invited some of you, Professor O, and also in many different, just some of the workshops. But then there's just one more to all this interest net, you know interest net, right? Just symbolizing, it's a sort of a Hindu symbol of connectivity of everything to everything else. But I actually knew Hassabis in some other way because he was actually planning to build, before artificial intelligence, what's called artificial hippocampus, just because this area of the brain is very interesting because it has been long known to be linked to this ability to remember and also forget efficiently. It's very important to be human in order to be able to forget, in order to be a human, because you cannot keep going just by accumulating so much knowledge, tidbits of information. Even in the relationships with other humans, if you keep remembering what your children did wrong to you, that's a really hard, right? But then this particular part is also increasingly been discovered to be related to the ability to move, which this is one of the insights that led him to really think about how to make use of this spatial representation and things like this for anyway, right? So I just copied this exactly from DeepMind page. Anyway, it was also the research that won the Nobel Prize in 2014. So about these policy and governance issues, I actually think of 4 different ways of really conceptualize some of our discussions about AI issues as technology and also policy problems. So the first one is for AI, so problems for AI, or issues that we should be addressing in order to advance AI technologies. So that's what I call, anyway, something for AI. And the second one is, this is more like basic science research, which is what can be done, what must be done in order to solve the challenges of current AI technologies. I intentionally use in the plural form instead of technology. The third one is, this is also some of the areas policymakers and also the general public are very much interested in, because we like to utilize this AI potentials really to the fullest, because there is a lot of fanfare about what this could bring to us. So what can be done to utilize AI technologies? The last one is also interesting problem, what can be done in order to address the problems which are emerging, but in fact have been anticipated a long time ago by social scientists and also other scholars of different fields. So some of the things I'm doing right now is kind of planning for the second building for KI. It's going to tentatively name the meta-convergence building. So this framework I used in order to make how we could configure the space in the building. So problems of AI and problems for AI and the problems with AI. And maybe I'm going to be involved in this part, problems by AI. So I'll just talk about only the 2 because we may not have enough time. The first one is what has been done for AI. So as you can see, anyway, 2016 has been really a watershed in terms of government support for AI technologies, because we have just so few projects, but then suddenly, in 4 years, this is 169 projects, but now almost 10-fold increase. And also there has been a lot of effort to advance basic research. And as Koreans all know about this project which began in the previous administration. It was conceived in May, just 2 months after the AlphaGo shock, and then formally announced in August 2016. And this is the big roadmap. But then what I see in these kinds of discussions and efforts to promote AI technologies, there are three tendencies. One, AI as sort of the next growth engine. So still is very much permeated with the discussion of how we can use these technologies in order to bring more wealth instead of increasing, say, quality of life or happiness. The second one, of course, this is a big part of the story because government policymakers are really promoting AI just as it's the core technology of the what's called the fourth industrial revolution. The second one, our policy discussion is very much associated with the catch-up strategy to reduce gaps with advanced countries. So this is one of the RFP in, I think it's the feasibility study report. So this is what's called the new normal age. We haven't been growing as much as we were before. I guess the growth rate has been under 3% for more than a decade, which is quite low compared to our 1960s or 70s, right? So, and also there is considerable linkage with the fourth industrial revolution, especially sometimes people actually think of AI much broader scope than 4IR. So it's sort of a super intelligence really connecting everything else. It's almost like Indra's net. But then I have been also talking a lot about fourth industrial revolution, whether this is a unique phenomenon. There's so much criticism about this. South Koreans really bandwagoning some recent trend, right? But then just recently I found it's actually not necessarily the case only with our own country, just because if you see these trends in the UK and also in Canada, you see this dramatic increase just suddenly, right? Emergence of the talks about AI technologies in parliamentary settings. And I haven't shown this in many other talks, but I have a series of, I brought only this, so I have been calculating how many books have been published. And I also have my own scheme of classifying these books. One, about the definition. Second, how we use these technologies. The third, the concerns and problems. But the fourth industrial revolution has already become the magnet for all kinds of publications these days, even to the point of sort of a panacea to all social problems. So I was thinking, I'm not a historian of technology, but I've been surrounded in my own department by historians of science and technology. So I've been asking these questions. So, for example, it's kind of a deja vu phenomenon. The famous economist visited South Korea in 1980s, but he already put this theory of 4 industrial revolutions. And then when he just dropped by Korea before going to Singapore, there was a really news article saying South Korea already at the footstep of the fourth industrial revolution, exactly the same prescription. We should be doing more research and development in science and technologies. And also, why we are so much concerned about this fourth industrial, concerned and also interested, is because although the name is industrial revolution, no industrial revolution has ever been just industrial, even just technological. In other words, we are actually agreeing whether, despite some criticisms or skepticisms, there must be something going on, right? Even at the level of perceptions. And as I said, also the third feature of our AI policy narratives is kind of a re-emergence of this perpetual mantra of catch-up. Like we should be following up very fast, narrowing the gap with the advanced countries. And then the next part. What's the problem with generated by AI? And this is from the World Economic Forum, in which I have been involved for a couple of years. They publish what's called the Global Risks Report every year. Last year it was 13th edition, but not every year they publish this kind of technological risk report. So you cannot really follow up this after 2016. So this is the latest one. So AI clearly leading all the other technologies as the technology that needs better governance. And more recently, there is what's called the Global AI Survey, which covered some of the major countries like the UK and some European countries. And now, when we think of this as sort of a representation of a global population, 67% already not know about AI, but know a lot about AI. But then, whether society will become worse, we have somewhat positive expectation. And also for individual scenarios about particular impacts or technology, we also see some of the positive perceptions. But here, interestingly, if you had the choice of going to an AI, now it's almost a half and half, which is quite interesting. And I think this is the most serious concern, one of the most serious concerns of policymakers, just because these days we have been really breaking every day the record of youth unemployment. So here we have a survey on how AI is going to impact jobs, things like this. But this is not really anything new. In fact, as I said, it's a sort of a deja vu phenomenon. Because 2015, these are all famous books about the impacts of AI technologies. So for instance, this book also is famous. It's not anymore only blue-collar workers, but also very high-level experts are also at the risk of getting fired, right? But then, again, every decade we have seen this sort of projection. Future of work, future of end of work, things like this, right? So we have I have another side note on technological unemployment. One is, there are two very, very famous reports, and it's not reports, but interestingly, they were published in the same year, and then they did updates just last year, exactly in 2 years. One is this paper by Oxford University scholars, and this is quite interesting because when this is so famous, and everybody cites this, but then the first paper, they used this expression, probability of computerization and employment, directly pointing out this linkage between automation, computerization, and then employment. But then just in 2 years, they switched it. They changed the expression because there was so much concern and worry about job displacement. They decided not to use that word. So probability of demand, more abstract projection of future employment growth. And the other famous report is going to be World Economic Forum, Future of Jobs. The previous one is Future of Work. So here, there is interesting differences, but it's becoming more precise rather than just rough conjecture about the percentage of demand change, but now they are calculating working hours. But what's interesting and also what makes it really hard to discuss technological unemployment is it's going to be actually slow, but still we have this sort of anthropomorphism, especially in computing technology, because there's a very interesting sort of almost a human, natural tendency to identify humanoid robots with really humans, right? So we have all these kinds of metaphors. Computers can read, write, or even catch a virus. So the fear about unemployment is, I guess, more what is that? It's getting more serious just because we have this sort of linkage between humanoid robots really taking our jobs, although that's such a long way from now. So finally, now what the World Economic Forum and other, for instance, UN and World Economic Forum, these global forums are, and also organizations are trying to do it with respect to AI and other emerging technologies is, in terms of policy making, it's not going to be just what to do, the box ticking, but rather we need more reflective action. What these new technologies would not only change some of our social institutions, but rather the nature or identity of humans. And also about these job displacement concerns, Professor Jason Zhang, very famous scientist at KAIST, also is making very strong emphasis and also trying to make a distinction between future of work clearly different from future of jobs, which is also clearly different from future of skills. So depending on which focus we have, we would have very, very different attitudes and also really public policy that would impact our own wages and incomes and future prospects for jobs. So these are some of the principles the World Economic Forum has put together. I'm also involved in this council. So the first element is going to be not individual technologies, but think of systems, and also value not as a bug to resolve or solve, but it's really is an essential feature of designing a technology. And also technology not determining what to do, but rather humans empowering humans. And finally, we really have to be careful when we make every step in our technological development to think about the impacts of technologies, not just by default or as an afterthought, but by design. So some of the other reports I'm introducing almost at the last part. This is 2017. I really wish you take a moment to check this. These two reports. One is McKinsey, and the other one just published last year. And this is quite interesting because yesterday, Tuesday, we had an all department evaluation meeting, which ran 11 hours on campus, and everybody was envying computer science department, the School of Computing, because everybody was flocking to this department. And then now this is also same trend you see in other universities. Undergrads enrolled in these courses, but don't get too happy just because there's a boom and bust. So this peak may not last. So like what you see in nuclear engineering, you never know what to happen, right? So be prepared. Finally, the question about whether machines think, which is a kind of what is it? The big question for computer science, especially AI. I guess the more fundamental question is, as the famous psychologists have already mentioned, the real question is not whether machines think, whether humans do. Right? Interesting question. And I really love this quote, computers are useless because they can only give answers. But I guess they may be able to create questions. Then, that's a big challenge. Okay. Finally, there's one more thing to add my own interest net for this AI technologies, because we tend to think of the technologies as more or less self-regulating and evolving, right? So as a natural evolution, but in fact, this has become the movie. We came to live in a world when man has walked on the moon, not just because it's a miracle created by technology, but just we decided to go, meaning we poured so much money. This was the largest human endeavor put into science and technology. And then even before the AlphaGo shock, you see this 2015, it was before 2016, already Hassabis was targeting for this AI program as the next Apollo program in basic science. So there's so much linkage in all this. That's all I brought today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will delay the questions until our second speaker is done. So I want to thank Professor Soyoung Kim again, especially for posing or for structuring AI with those four keywords, right? So for AI, of AI, with AI, and by AI. So she talked about for and by AI, which were very appropriate. And this forum is designed such that we have one who is really talking about the technology, and the second or third, one or two describing what are the impacts of the technology. And so she has first given us what are the societal impacts, how do we co-design our policies for these AI technologies. And now for our second speaker, we have Professor In-Sung Kim of MIT. The prestige, that you hear about, that I can tell you about Professor Kim is that already, just by having that name MIT, right, gives you prestige. He's also gotten his PhD from Princeton, and his dissertation was awarded an award in political economy, and I mean, I'm not in that field, so I don't know, but it's apparently an award for the best dissertation in political economy for 2 years, for the last 2 years. So that proves to you that he is really an excellent researcher. But to add to that, I want to just take a little bit more time to tell you why I invited him to this forum as in this inaugural session. We actually collaborate with him for the other two keywords, right? So of and with AI. So of AI is the AI technology itself, and with AI is how AI can be used in other disciplines as well. And in that, we can actually think as researchers about the three things that we care most about, right? The research question, what is the question we're interested in, and research data, or what kind of data are we working with, and the method, right? What kind of method or technology are we working with? And so Professor Kim is actually an expert in all of those. He does quantitative methodology for political science, which was very surprising to me. It's almost like he's a computer scientist himself. If you look at the methods that he uses and develops, it's very technical, it's very mathematical, it's almost like what we do. And also the data set that he collected, and you will hear more about it in his talk, is huge. It has domain expertise, which we don't have as computer scientists. And with that huge and excellent data set, he can ask the most relevant and most appropriate research questions about political science and how we can apply the computational method to learn more about political science. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor In-Sung Kim. Thank you very much.
Should I hold this, or does it work here? Can you hear me? Is it okay? Okay. Thank you very much for the generous introduction, Professor Oh. And I would like to begin by thanking the AIX committee members for the invitation. It's my honor to give a presentation about my work here at KAIST. Today I'm going to present my work on mapping political communities. This is joint work with Tim Kuniski at NYU Mathematics Department. This project is part of the broader project supported by the National Science Foundation and MIT. Lobbying is significant in legislative politics. Special interest groups lobby to promote their political objectives, while politicians can gain information for their legislative decisions by working with lobbyists. Despite the importance of lobbying and the connection between interest groups and politicians, there exists very few empirical studies of political connections. Why? We all agree that the connection between interest groups and politicians are important, right? In political science, there exists very, very few empirical studies of this. Why?
It's a sensitive issue.
It's a sensitive issue, okay? Data is hard to gain. It's because we simply don't observe them, right? Politicians won't say that, oh, I met with this lobbyist who got paid $1 million from this particular firm, right? We discussed about this particular issue, right? While the interest groups won't say that, oh, I spent $1 million, right, talking about these policy issues, right, with this particular politician. It can be politically very sensitive, right? And as a researcher, it's very frustrating because we all know that these relations are very important to understand the legislative politics, but we simply don't observe them. The political connections are latent, right? We don't observe them, right? So in this project, we merge two observable political behaviors. First is interest groups lobbying on legislative bills. And second is politicians sponsoring of each one of those bills. These are things that we can observe. With these information, we can make an inference about the latent political networks, right, that we don't observe. So that's the fundamental goal of this project. So here's an example. Here's a Senate bill to exempt the aging process of distilled spirits from the production period for purposes of capitalization of interest costs. This is a very, very important bill. Do you agree? If you're interested in bourbon whiskey, this bill is very, very important, right? That's a UK bill? This is the United States, in the US, yeah. In the US, bourbon whiskey, distilled spirits, this is the bill about exempting some interest cost, right, which will affect the taxation, basically. Right? This is a bill that will eventually affect how the certain firm will get tax exemption, right, due to the particular process they use for distill the spirit. Right? This bill was introduced by Senator Mitch McConnell. Right? And what I did was to look for the entire universe of the lobbying activities around this bill. I was trying to find all the interest groups that were interested in this particular bill. Right. How many interest groups do you think that were interested in this particular bill in the United States? Just a guess, random number. 20. 100. 100. Okay. Distilled Spirit Council of the United States was the only interest group that lobbied on this bill. Okay? So here's another example that I like. I study international trade. So I study international political economy, which is one of the subfields in political science. And here's a bill to reduce temporarily the duty on certain audio headphones, achieving full spectrum noise reduction. How many of you have used the noise canceling headphones for improving the quality of your research? Okay. For us, this is a very, very important bill, right? Do you agree? Do you agree? Okay. So this bill was sponsored by Senator John Kerry from Massachusetts. Okay. And again, what I did was I was trying to find the universe of the lobbying activities around this particular bill. This is a very, very important bill for me because I love to use my noise canceling headphone. So I'm deeply interested in knowing what kind of interest groups are interested in this particular bill. And I found that Bose Corporation was the only interest group that lobbied on this particular bill. By the way, Bose was founded by a former MIT professor and is headquartered in Massachusetts. So the motivation of this paper is very simple, right? How can we identify political communities if they exist, right? And how can we learn about their memberships that we don't observe? Okay? Are you all clear with the motivation? Good.
But there are many clustering mechanisms to identify political communities, right? There's been study of U.S. legislation clustering based on keywords, etc. So, when you say identify political communities, I think you should narrow down the scope and what type of communities and such.
Sure. So by political communities, it's pretty abstract at this point, right? So by political communities, I mean a group of politicians and interest groups who might share some interest in a certain policy domain, right? We want to learn a set of politicians and interest groups, right, who somehow interact more frequently than others.
So you're like trying to see ties between politicians and interest groups.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes. And and if we assume that there exists a certain communities, finite number of communities, we also want to learn about who belong to those communities, the politicians and interest groups. Okay. So we make several contributions with this project. We developed a new lobbying network database where we link more than 20,000 interest groups that have ever lobbied since 1999 in the United States. With 1,164 politicians, the senators, and House of Representatives in the United States. We then developed a latent space network model to estimate the spatial parameter that underlie the political interactions between the politicians and interest groups. To preview our results, we find that we don't know what's underlying the interaction, but what we found is that whatever that is underlying their interaction is non-ideological. From a political scientist perspective, this is very surprising because the previous studies, for example, that used similar network data coming from the campaign contribution, or the Facebook or Twitter network, where you analyze how individuals follow or like the politicians or politicians' webpage, often find that the network is driven by ideological factors. However, for this lobbying network, what we find is that the primary factors that underlie the political interaction is non-ideological. Instead, we find that these factors are very strongly correlated with the industry and committee affiliation of the interest groups and the politicians. We then moved to applying the community detection model developed in the computer science field, where we can directly estimate the political community memberships, right, if they exist. And we find that, I'm going to show you, but communities that we find are localized and very consistent, right, with the findings that we had in the latent spatial model. We then developed and proposed a bipartite link community model, where we allow for a distribution of the multiple memberships, right, over multiple communities, and the connection types. And I'm going to go in detail about what I mean by these connection types, and we believe that this is one of the methodological contributions that we are making with this project. From this model, we find that the members of the procedure committees, such as Ways and Means committees, and the large aggregate organizations like Chamber of Commerce have a very distinct pattern in terms of their community membership, in which they have multiple memberships over different communities. So in the political science literature, this is very important in that there's been a deep interest in understanding the interest group's power and the committee powers, right, in understanding the legislative politics. But recently, in the field of the American politics, which is another subfield of the political science, people have found the importance of ideological divide in the Congress, which has been a primary factor that scholars focus it on in understanding the legislative politics. So our study basically brings the interest in the committee back in the study of the legislative politics. Any questions? By the way, feel free to interrupt. I would like to have this more interactive, and you know, that's in that way it's much better. And how much time do I have until what? When? Should I? What? 25 more minutes. Okay. Oh, okay. I thought that it is gonna go a little bit longer. Okay. So minimally interrupt, please. So here's data, right? Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 requires all firms and interest groups to report their lobbying activities on any congressional bills that they lobby. So here's an example from Google 2013. You see that Google lobbied on a Safe Data Act, right? And this bill is a House Bill number 2577 and Senate Bill number 1207. And you can see that Google lobbied on other bills. Right? What I did was to scrape all the lobbying reports that have been filed in the United States since 1995 and developed a natural language processing algorithm to go through all those contents of the lobbying report, right? And then try to identify bills based on their number and then their titles. Right? You would think that it is very easy to do that, but in fact that I actually spent the past 8 years of my life trying to improve the data quality for this. And of course that it is not perfect, but we are really, really confident that we've identified most of the majority of the activities around any of the bills in the United States. We study more than 108,000 congressional bills. This is the universe of the congressional bills introduced since the 106th Congress. We then, for each one of those bills, find the instances of lobbying based on more than 1 million lobbying reports filed in the United States. Once you do that, there are some interesting patterns that you can see. Right? More than 12,000 bills are introduced in each Congress. Okay? Out of that, the majority of that, right, have been reported or found to be lobbied. You'd wonder what explains this big increase here. This is because of the data problem. Right? There's a law change around this time, 2007, where the lobbying report turned into electric filing. So everything was digitized, which means that it was much easier to parse and it's much easier to identify the bills that are lobbied. Right? Before then, a lot of reports were even handwritten. It's extremely difficult to parse. Right? So this is, we believe that this is a data problem. So today, the results will be based on the period after this digitization of the lobbying report. Right? Another important pattern that you see is that as we saw in our two motivating examples in the previous slides, right, there are only a very few interest groups that lobbied on any given bill. You can see a very skewed distribution of the number of the unique interest groups that lobbied on any given bill. Right? You see that most of the bills are lobbied by only 1 or 2 interest groups, where when there are 2, it turned out that the other is a subsidiary of the parent firm. So it is basically the one. Right? Of course, there are bills that are lobbied by many, many interest groups. So you can imagine the United States and Korea FTA, the Free Trade Agreement bill, has been lobbied by a lot of interest groups. Right? But you see that majority of the bills are lobbied, and the majority of them are actually lobbied by 1 or 2 interest groups. Right? Suggesting the fact that understanding the narrow, targeted lobbying, right, in the US is very, very important. So let's move on to the latent space network model. We denote interest group by I. There are M interest groups, and there are N politicians denoted by J. Aij is the number of times that interest group I, firm I, lobbied on a bill that is sponsored by politician J, right? So it is a number, okay? With this Aij, you can form an interaction matrix or adjacency matrix A that is M by N, where each element captures the degree of the interaction, right, between interest group I and politician J. Is this clear? Right. With this, right, you can model this Aij as a Poisson distributed. Poisson is a typical distribution for modeling the discrete numbers, right, the count. Right? So we use the Poisson distribution, right, for modeling this Aij distributed with the mean mu ij. And mu ij is in turn modeled as a function of alpha I and beta j, which is the popularity factors for interest group I and J. Right? By popularity factor, what I mean is that some interest groups tend to lobby a lot, right? And some politicians tend to sponsor a lot of bills. So we want to capture that in our modeling. Here, there's a theta and psi, which is the latent position of the interest group I and politician J. So we don't know what that is. We cannot interpret this. But what we assume here is that whatever that it is, the multidimensional theta and psi of the interest group and politician respectively, if those are close to each other, right? So that's this part, right? If they're close to each other, right, then because there's a minus sign, the mu will increase, right? The smaller the distance, the higher the mu. The higher the mu, more likely to have a higher number for Aij, which means that I don't know, right, what that is, but there's some, let's say that there's some two-dimensional space, right, where you have your own preferred point, and I have my own preferred point. If those are close to each other, then we will meet more often. Here, meeting is measured as the number of times that I lobbied on a bill that you sponsor. Okay? So I'm going to present a result for the first result based on this model. On the x-axis, this is a one-dimensional model. So theta and psi are assumed to be one-dimensional. And in the x-axis, what I'm going to show is the estimated number for that psi for the politicians. Okay? So we don't know what that is, some latent thing, some number, right, that we estimate based on our data. On the y-axis, I'm going to present the DW nominee score, which is a standard measure in political science that captures the ideology of the politicians. Right? So each politician in the United States, right, will be given a number. Right? Let's say that you are number 5. That means that you are really, really conservative. You are number -5, which means that you are really liberal, and so forth. So imagine that each politician will have a number that will capture the degree of the ideological leaning, right? So if our estimated latent embedding, right, is ideological, right, then you'd expect that the lines, the points will be aligned along, let's say, the 45-degree line, or at least a positively correlated. Right? What do you expect, given the preview of the result?
No correlation.
I told that it is non-ideological, so we don't find any correlation here, right? So on the one-dimensional from a one-dimensional model, the latent space position that we estimate is not correlated with the typical measure of the ideology that political scientists use. Right? We move on to the two-dimensional model, and we do the same exercise for the first dimension and second dimension, and we also find here that whatever that underlies the lobbying interaction, right, is not correlated with the ideological factors. Right? Which again, right, as I mentioned earlier, is very, very surprising to political scientists.
So you mean Republican and Democratic alignment is not in the analysis of result?
Yes, that's correct. So
ideological.
Yeah. So if I put it in a more substantive context, so if I'm an interest group, right? Let's say that I have a liberal agenda, and you are a politician who has a liberal agenda, right? You think that, okay, I'm going to lobby you, right, so that we can jointly promote our liberal agenda in legislative politics. What I find is that that's not true. Right? What I find is that I have a liberal agenda. I know that you have a liberal agenda. I don't care whether you have a liberal agenda, as long as you help me, right? If you have a conservative agenda, that's fine. If you are useful for me, I'm going to lobby you. This is a more extreme way of interpreting this result, right? Of course, right? But to help you understand what this means is by non-ideological, you can see this in that way. Okay. So what I did was what I'm going to show you is that on the it's the 2D model, right? I'm going to put all the estimated point of that latent theta and the psi in this space. Okay, this is we don't know what it is, but we find some number in the two-dimensional space. We all remember that if those two are close to each other, then these actors are interacting more frequently. Okay, so here are politicians, right? Where the here are clients. Sorry, so here are clients, the firms, right? the size of the dot is proportional to the popularity factor. So the interest groups that lobby a lot, simply, right, will have a bigger dot size. And the location of this dot represents this theta parameter, which we assume to be very important in driving the interaction. So here are politicians. It's hard to see with the light, but there are blue and red dots. Again, the size of the dot is proportional to the popularity factor. Right? There are some politicians who tend to introduce a lot of bills. Right? And the blue means that Democrats, and the red means Republicans. Do you see any pattern here?
Some big dots.
Okay, that's an important observation. Any pattern? Do you see any distinct pattern here?
Looks like Europe.
Okay, that's a very artistic interpretation. Yeah. So one of the problems of this, this class of model, right, the latent spatial model, right, is that it's really difficult to interpret, right? We assume that there's something underlying here, but we really don't know how to interpret those dimensions. So as a researcher, what we need to do is that we need to go through each point, the estimates one by one, which is what we did. Right? So what we did is we went through each estimated points and then see the identity of this interest group and politicians, right? Hoping to see, right, if there are any patterns and hoping to get some understanding of these dimensions. What we quickly realized is that there exists a pattern. Right? Turned out that these interest groups are from a finance industry. So for example, the Bank of America, right, belongs to this particular region. By the way, I have to emphasize that this particular region, right, is drawn arbitrarily by us. Right? We just went through those dots and then we just drew this circle boundary arbitrarily, and because we think that, okay, within this region there are some finance firms. Okay? We did a similar thing, right? Here it turned out that these are the interest groups that belong to the insurance industry. One of the benefits of having this spatial model is that space makes sense, right? So notice that the finance and insurance are close to each other in this two-dimensional space. We went through the entire space and found that, okay, there exists a very clear clustering. Right? For example, here, there are clusters of the technology firms. The machine doesn't know about the identity of this each individual interest group. But it turned out that the method will retrieve some interesting pattern where the Google, Yahoo, Amazon, right? These firms belong to this particular region. Right? What about the politicians? Right? It turned out that the politicians that belong to each one of those clusters, right, are the ones who serve in a committee that have direct jurisdictions over these industries. So you see that the finance and insurance clusters, the politicians within that region, right, majority of them belong to the Financial Services Committee and Banking and Housing Committee. For the energy cluster, the politicians in that region serve in Energy, Commerce Committee and Natural Resources Committee. Right? What's intriguing for us was the center region. Right? The center region is this dotted region here, right? Where we actually had a very huge difficulties in identifying the patterns. We couldn't see an obvious industry clustering. We didn't see an obvious committee membership clustering. One thing that we noticed, however, is that this center region is populated by the politicians who serve in a procedure committees or power committees, such as Ways and Means Committee and Appropriations Committee. Okay? And the later models that we're going to introduce will have to do with dealing with this center region, which I'm going to go in detail shortly. So how can we understand these dimensions, this is space? Do you have a question?
I think a lot of the audience may not be familiar with what Ways and Means and Appropriations do
okay.
In this context. So do you briefly...
Sure. So Ways and Means Committee is committee, 위원회, in the Congress, where the committee considers important bills about the taxation primarily. Okay, So if there is a bill about the taxation, the Ways and Means Committee will
it maps
consider.
to what committee in Korea?
So that I don't know, but so any insightful comment from political scientist or 예산위원회. Okay. Yes. Oh, actually, yes. So appropriations committee might be. So appropriations committee is more about the 예산. Yeah, the spending is. Yeah. So you can think of the 예산위원회 or anything that has to do with the tax, right? Will be these two committees. Okay. So what we did was that we run a regression, right, of the latent, the spatial estimates, right, on various factors that we observe, right. Try to see what are the factors that are correlated with those dimensions, right. And what we did was that we did the F-test. I don't know whether you are all familiar with the F-test, right? So we run a restricted model where we remove the committee variable, and then we include the variable which we call as a full model, and then we see whether including the committee membership in our regression significantly improves our understanding of the latent variable, right? It turned out that it is the case. Right? It turned out that the committee members' membership variable for the politicians explained the variation both for the first dimension of so the one-dimensional model and then the first dimension of the 2D and the second dimension of the 2D. They're all statistically significant. The p-value here is essentially 0. We found some evidence for the geography. So if we include the state variable, then although we don't find a statistical significance in the one-dimensional model, but when we move to the two-dimensional model, we found that the first dimension of this, the two-dimensional model is explained a lot by the geography. Right? So what we basically are backing out in this spatial model is what you're backing out here is the committee membership and the geography, but not ideology, okay? Which is the DW nominate, which is corresponding to this particular column here. Okay? And we find a similar result for the interest groups, for the industry affiliations. So I told you that it is very important to note that the boundaries that we drew were arbitrary, that were chosen by us, right? And I assumed sort of that there exists clusters basically. I assumed that we can, by drawing these boundaries, these are some groupings, right? Right. There's an implicit assumption that we made when we were drawing these boundaries. So we were interested in, can we really interpret the clusters as political communities, right? And again, the definition of the political communities here is that the set of politician and interest groups that tend to interact more often in legislative activities. To understand that, we modified the model just a little bit. So AIJ is now again modeled as Poisson distribution with the mean alpha I, beta J, which is the popularity factor. We do the degree correction, if you're familiar with the literature, to account for the fact that there are many politicians who tend to be very active and so forth, as well as for the interest groups. And here the B is the matrix, the K by L matrix, and we assume the dimension of the K and L. The intuition basically here is that, okay, there's some finite number of communities, all right? And the interest groups belong to one of those communities, and politicians belong to one of those communities. And for particular two set of the communities, they tend to interact more frequently. Okay, so very simplistic form. If you belong to community number 1 and I belong to community number 1, then we tend to interact more frequently than the case where you belong to community 1 and I belong to community 3. Okay? So with this, what we can do is that we can estimate the finite number of the community membership for each interest group and politicians. What we did is that we kept this two-dimensional space. We also kept this arbitrary boundaries that we had before, right? And what I'm going to show you is to present the estimated community membership, right, using 8 different colors. So assuming that there exists 8 different communities, what this model allows you to do is that, okay, you are in community green, you are in community orange, and so forth, right? What I'm going to do is that for each dot that we had before, right, rather than using the black, red, and green, red and blue, I'm going to use this community membership as a color, right? So if it is indeed the case that the arbitrary drawing that we had, right, is consistent with the idea of some underlying finite community members, then you would expect that the same colors will be clustered in the same region. Okay? Turned out that it is the case. You can see that this is the energy cluster that we had, that the orange triangle here are clustered in this region. And here, the finance and insurance, our model, right, is telling that these are indeed the one community. Of course, you can increase the number of communities so that you can actually distinguish this. But at least for this model, you see that this is captured as one single community and so forth. What we found very intriguing, we were very excited after we saw this result, but we found very intriguing by the fact that, okay, this community, the cross here, the brown cross here, these are far away in the spatial sense, but estimated to be belonging to the same community. Whereas here, these are very close in a spatial setup, but they're estimated to belong to different communities. Right? In fact, in this center region that I briefly talked about, it wasn't really clear, right, whether there exists any pattern in terms of the dominance of the single color. Right? So what we did was to zoom in to this particular region and to understand who they are. It turned out that this gray dots over here, we call as land use interest groups, right, which consist of the National Rifle Association as well as the Defenders of the Wildlife. And this particular, the brown cross, we call it a civil society interest group, which includes the Senior Citizens League as well as some labor interest groups. So this is very interesting, right? And it motivated our modeling development, right? As I said, that if you belong to the red community and I belong to red community, then we tend to interact more often. But we are asking, oh, it may be the case that I belong to the red community sometimes and then green communities the other times, right? I am a member of the MIT as a faculty member, but I'm a member of my family as a dad. Right? So I play multiple roles depending on which community that I belong to. This is called a mixed membership model in computer science. What I also found intriguing in this literature, at least the class of the model that are available, right, assumes that the type of the interaction, right, even though they allow for the multiple memberships, right, tend to be of one single kind. Right? That is, okay, you can belong to the red. Sometimes I can belong to the red. We are primarily red kinds, and then therefore when we talk, we're going to talk about the red issues, which certainly is not the case in politics. Right? If you look at the Chamber of Commerce and Barbara Boxer, they're interacting a lot, but they sometimes talk about the Water Resources Development Act, and other times they talk about the United States and Israel Strategic Partnership Act. So what motivated politically for this and methodologically is that we want to capture that capture the fact that sometimes the actors will interact in a red kind, sometimes the actors will interact in a green kind, talking about different issues. So this is the proposed bipartite linked community model. I'll go just quickly, right? This is the same model, but we model as a weighted average, right, of this multiple community membership in terms of the linkage and the community membership. And then we estimate these parameters using EM algorithm, which is quite fast to estimate those parameters. Once you do that, we can actually estimate each single political actors, the community membership, multiple community membership. And we see that, these political actors tend to have a concentrated membership on a single community, while at the center region that we had before, we had a rainbow, which means that the politician interest group that belong to this region turned out to have actually the multiple membership. So to give you an example, Microsoft tend to have a concentrated membership in a single community, right? Which is represented by this histogram, where there is the distribution over the different members, 8 different distinct communities. You see that it's concentrated mass on the one single community. And you see that the lobbying patterns for the Microsoft is pretty single kind, where it's about the Startup Act and cybersecurity, surveillance, transparency, which can be technology-related issues. Whereas if you look at the Chamber of Commerce, you see the distribution over the multiple community memberships, and you see that this particular interest group represents very heterogeneous interests across a very heterogeneous groups, and therefore you see a diverse set of bills that are lobbied. For the politicians, you see that Harry Reid, Chuck Schumer, and Mark Rubio, these politicians tend to have a multiple community membership, whereas there are a set of politicians who have a concentrated membership on a single community. So to wrap up, network data has become increasingly available in social science research. I study international trade, and in fact, this research was motivated by my frustration in studying international trade network and an input-output network in global supply chain. So I would like to apply these set of methods, and I'm looking forward to a collaborative research with the researchers here at KAIST on international trade data as well, which I'm more than happy to discuss. I developed a new lobbying database, right? And I made all the data that I talk about today are freely available via www.lobbyview.org. If you have time, please, after this talk, visit this webpage. I created a 2-minute introduction video for you, which explains my project. I didn't use Twitter before, but I tried to use Twitter from now on a little bit more actively to give you an update about this lobbying data and other functionalities that we're going to provide in terms of the data download and visualization. So my Twitter handle is Insong Kim. So if you're interested in learning more about the lobby view, please follow me. We developed a statistical method to identify political communities and their memberships. If there is one takeaway message that I want you to have to go back home with, is that first we allow you to study this, right, with our own packages, right? So please think about this more carefully for your research questions, right? More specifically for my research question about the legislative politics, the message here is a political representation in legislative politics is fundamentally different from the ideological politics, where the latter has been found to be driven by ideological factors. Thank you very much.
The last statement conclusion is people are voting wrongly based on wrong, or the senators, I mean the people in the Congress and Senate are not voting based on their electoral voters?
So I don't want to get into a normative discussion about this too much, but so political representation, right, the election works differently, obviously. That's the main message. Whether the interest groups representation, right, where you see the disproportionate representation of some special interest group is consistent with the electoral behavior, is something that we need to think more hard about. Because let's say that Bose lobbied on a noise canceling headphone in Massachusetts, right? Senator Kerry might be catering to the special interests of the Bose Corporation in that sense, but you can also argue that Bose can create the employment in the local economy, right? It will create overall welfare benefits for the Massachusetts, and Senator Kerry was elected to represent Massachusetts. So in that sense, I don't think that lobbying is necessarily bad. People think lobbying as bribery, but this is really not the bribery. This is a legitimate way of aggregating the preferences of the various interest groups and we are fortunate enough to have this data so that we can at least begin analyzing this. So certainly this is at the very outset of this very long-term project. Thanks.
One question per each participant, hopefully. And also, please restrict your questions or kind of make your questions more broad rather than about very specific details of the talk that we've heard. You may have those specific questions, but you can maybe save them for later or email the speakers. For now, we're going to talk about AI plus X, what it means to us, what they feel like it's when it's impactful and important for the society, and what are the future directions, right? The big things. So let's first begin with an introductory or sort of a greeting from our School of Computing head, or our department head, Professor Byung-ho Kim. He is paying for all of this, so he's an important person.
Distinguished invited speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to have the first AI+X forum today held by School of Computing and KAIST. I would like to extend my cordial and warm welcome to all of you, and would like to express a big appreciation to organizers and invited speakers who give great talks today. We recognize AI technology has been having successfully applied to many applications in various industries, manufacturing, commerce, finance, and even to art and various types of mass media. In this regard, I think this series of talks can play an important role in promoting interdisciplinary academic areas, including engineering, social science, and to name a few. And I think that, and I hope that through this forum, we can share success of our experience of our success and future hopes, and more importantly, various issues that may possibly occur by this new emerging AI technology. And once again, I would like to express cordial, would like to extend cordial I would like to heartily welcome all of you and express sincere appreciation to invite speakers and organizers of this forum. Thank you.
Move right into questions. Professor So-young Kim has to leave a little bit early, so let's take questions for the policy aspect, co-designing policy in AI. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I will bring the mic to you.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I wanted to ask about the future of something. You talked about the future of work, jobs, and skills, and what about the future of wages? I'm wondering, is it because of the wage difference? AI, skills would just, if you have AI skill, you get paid so much. Is that why we think the future of jobs or work related to AI is important because of the wages?
So now I can add one more to my future of something. So future of work, future of jobs, and future of skills, and finally future of wages. And this is actually more relevant to the discussion of economic, micro and also macroeconomic relationships between wages and employment. And in fact, economists have been, well, Professor Kim also political economist, so very much knowledgeable about how wages move together with employment. So this is not a separate discussion from employment, but what we have observed so far is somehow we have seen so dramatic increase in inequality in both income and wages, especially in income including wages and salaries, but also assets, wealth. So the problem is not only income inequality, but also increasing rise in wealth inequality, which really makes it very hard for policymakers to reverse the trend. If it's only income inequality, we can actually apply some very proactive policy to reduce the gaps, because incomes in the end is the sort of the result of your individual effort, but wealth is somehow more inherited from your parents, which is much harder structural problem. But the question is whether technology, especially AI, how much it is really responsible for increasing gap in these kinds of inequalities, which is a big question for economists. But as I remember in the 1990s, the question is whether this is because of skill-biased economic change, I guess it is skill-biased technological change, or globalization, just because increasing low-wage jobs are moving to China and India, these kinds of countries. So, but then now, I guess economists have come to a little bit of a conclusion that skill-driven bias in wages is really increasing. And so the question for policymakers is how much actually, how much of this proactive effort can have really an impact on. Well, that's also a question for Korean society and also other countries. Can I just make a quick comment on Professor Kim's presentation, because there's another part of this interest net, just because we are very close friends, whether you believe or not. And in fact, I brought the picture we took together just in 2000, maybe 3 or 4, and today we met almost in probably 10 years. So I brought the picture here to show you, to show the changes, but suddenly he looks so young, so I gave up. But then anyway, the point is, in his presentation, there's a very interesting observation I had before. I guess this is a kind of a Seoul National University Physics Department professor problem. It's a long problem, but that's very close to what he presented, because I'm also a political scientist. We always believe the power of ideology really affecting policy directions, whether you are elected and also whether you actually take power. But his presentation is you become a different person, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So once you are elected, you are not necessarily obliged to keep the promise, which we always find in everyday life. So this is a rabbit versus a hare problem. So anyway, so SNU physics professor problem is basically, this is a very funny story. Usually professors, they have been very politically conservative. So they have been very close friends of the former presidents. But interestingly, they are also close friends of politicians of the opposition party. So regardless of who becomes the president, who takes power, usually science, SNU physics department is guaranteed to have some beneficial effects from some science policies. So you are kind of lobbying not only for lobbying the congressman of your own ideological leaning, but also the other party, just as an insurance.
So one topic I would like to hear your comments on is the idea of AI eventually replacing politicians, which I think would, some people may see this as a very appealing idea. And specifically what I mean is politics and even lobbying, as you mentioned, is a mechanism for societies to aggregate opinions and to kind of come to decision making in this kind of uncertain information environment. And this is possibly something that you may apply AI to as well, in terms of trying to figure out from some large data sets, social media, what is the preference of the population, and have some sort of objective way of making a decision based on that. How far away are we from that kind of feature, and what kind of issues might come up from that?
Again, I'm a political scientist. So I have long been interested in what politics means and what political scientists can do. But politics, this is an undergraduate textbook introduction. Political science is understood as the study of two things, basically. One, power, and the other, collective choice. So power meaning the ability to have, whether enforce or persuade whatever, someone else to do what you want. So that's the power aspect. But the other one, the collective decision or choice, is essentially, it's a mathematical problem in a sense, just because you have these individual preferences for particular policies, which would be mapped into a collective decision. It's almost like functional mapping of multiple components in this set to this, right? So for the second aspect of collective choice, perhaps it's much easier to apply AI technologies, because it's a very similar decision we face every day in making some public choice, right, to address some common problems we face together. But for the other part, that's a very different area involving a lot of persuasion, or as I said, coercion, or some sort of rhetorical stuff. So that's going to be very difficult to replace. So there's some still remaining role for political scientists as well as politicians.
May I ask?
Yes, we would definitely like to hear.
Yeah, I would like to ask the question to Professor Kim. So my understanding of the politics of political science is, of course, is consistent with the power and the collective action. But another way of looking at the politics is winners and losers, right? I always think about the politics as the winners and losers. So who do you think are going to be the winners and losers of the fourth industrial revolution, and how should the wealth or the power for the winners should be redistributed to the losers in this new generation?
This is like to ask a question that you cannot answer, right? Just because Professor Kim probably already know of this. Of course, there is what's called the compensation principle. So when there is a policy change from the status quo, then we usually make the case for pushing that policy, just arguing that probably there will be losers, but still the losers can compensate it for their loss just by the gains to winners. So if we have enough gain earned by winners, so some of these gain can be redistributed to the losers, which is a very common argument made by people pushing a particular policy. That's what we saw, for instance, in major political and policy changes. For instance, Korea, U.S. free trade agreement, for instance, for this free trade agreement, the winners were high-tech and automobile industries, but losers were agriculture. But still, the case was made that winners would win so much that they can give up a little bit of their gains to compensate for the loss of the losers. So this is what's called, this is again Nobel Prize winning theory, like Higgs problem of compensation. But that's in theory. But what happens after the deal was made? Of course, this is just written on paper, and what the gains hypothetically can be distributed, but not necessarily really after the gain is made. So how we can redistribute some of the gains of winners of the fourth industrial revolution is going to be a very big question for policymakers. But then again, going back to Professor Cha's question, when the gap is so much, then I'm curious whether winners would have enough motivation, in a sense, to yield some of the gains. So OECD and the World Economic Forum these days are making they have phrased the term called inclusive growth. So it's not only growth for its own sake, but rather growth just trying to really include many segments of society, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that effort, but not really much I can say so far.
Just quick for her. So there's a question about whether AI can replace politicians. And there is an NPR survey done with some university, and then so the goal was trying to figure out or estimate which job categories will be replaced by AI with what percentages. And for instance, a data scientist would be replaced by AI in 20 years, maybe the percentage of about 60%. And there's one category called the CEO, maybe like politicians. It was only 2%, so it's a kind of bad news for you.
Thank you. Thanks for the data. And I have a simple question. I felt I don't know well about the U.S. Political system, but I felt the committee might not have the equal power. I feel some committee might have more power, or size might be different. So have you ever thought about weighting depending on the size and also influence of each committee? And my second question is, I wonder, have you ever thought about the social implication of your work? And thank you.
Thank you. So, of course, there are certain committees that are more or less important than other committees. Important in a sense that it will probably affect the welfare of the larger number of people, rather than a very specific set of subgroups in the society. So in that sense, I don't think that there's no unimportant committees. All committees are important, but certain committees and committee members definitely have powers, and that's why those procedure committees or this Ways and Means and Appropriations Committee that we consider are called the power committees. They actually have great power that affect a large number of people at once. For the weighting committee, so in our model, from methodological perspective, we don't include any committee at all in our analysis. What we all do is the number of times that politicians introduce the bills, right? So if you're a politician that doesn't serving in a certain committee, of course you probably will introduce the bills that are related to your committee work, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're restrained to primarily propose the bills in that area. Senator Kerry, for example, right? I don't think that his committee is primarily, he's a more foreign relations expert in the U.S. Politics, and policy towards the noise canceling headphone is not necessarily foreign security issues, right? So you can see the diverse set of interest groups interacting with the politicians differently, and the committee can be a channel, but the politician can be the node that I think that I'm interested in analyzing. In terms of the implication of my research on perhaps the society or the policy, honestly, I haven't actually thought about that. What I, as a social scientist, am interested in is pursuing the truth, trying to understand what really drives the legislative politics. We really want to improve our understanding of that first, and I hope that the awareness of the important roles that the special interest groups play in this legislative politics would increase the awareness of the general public, and which will in turn will be translated in, let's say, the voting behavior or the other behavioral changes. But I haven't actually thought about how exactly that's going to happen. One thing that I was trying really hard to raise awareness of this is to provide this data set publicly, right? So one of the main projects that I'm doing with this lobby view is that it will make extremely easy for anyone who's interested in politics to search what type of the bills that their own politicians are introducing, whether there's a consistent with their decision when they're casting the vote. It's up to them, right, to evaluate and reconsider their behavior in the future. If that happens, then that can be a way that this can have an impact on the policy. But as a scientist, I primarily am interested in knowing the truth. Can I respond to the replacing the, so about the machines that replacing the politician, and it is unfortunate that only a small portion of the politicians will be replaced. First, that statement implicitly assumes that machines will be better, right, than the humans playing the role as a politician, right? I don't know whether that statement is necessarily true, right? I don't know whether a machine, by replacing human being, will make our lives better, right? What's smaller cost? Smaller cost? Of course, there is transaction cost, but there are other, auxiliary costs that we probably won't imagine even that will be associated. So if you look at, so I study international trade, right? So if you study economics, there's this concept of the benevolent dictator, right? So if you look at the economic models, then you see that suppose that there is a benevolent dictator that optimizes the welfare of the society, and this is the optimal level of the policy, right? If there exists a person, right, who can make the optimal decision that can redistribute the wealth and then increase overall wealth and so forth. The reason why this particular concept is important is that for international trade, you'd hear that economists will say that the trade liberalization is what all countries should follow. Right? You should remove the trade barriers so that you can concentrate on your comparative advantage. Right? If you are good at producing automobile and the others are good at producing textile, they should focus on textile. I should focus on producing automobile, and we're going to freely exchange these two products, which will actually theoretically will make our lives better off. However, that's not happening because of this winners and losers problem. Right? If the textile will come freely to my country, then those who are working in the textile industry will lose. Right? So this is a political. Right? So there are losers who will go to the parliament, all right, and protest, and then sometimes the farmers will jump into the sea, right, because it's about their lives. Right? So when the machines will replace the human being as a politician, right? Maybe it will optimally calculate, but that optimal, right, is somewhat very difficult to define, right? Because there always is going to be the winners and losers. If the machine says that okay, you should remove all the textile industries, right? That's good for your society. Should we do that? Because the machine will say so. Is it a good policy, right? What about the lives of the family members, of the people who are working in this textile industry and so forth? So that's why I think that the deep thinking about the winners and losers and the roles the machines will play in that will be very important. But the politics is very important for all of this. We talk about this AI plus X. Today, the X seems to be the political science. I know a lot of you are interested in AI and computer science, but I really strongly encourage you to think really hard about the social sciences. There are many social scientists who are interested in a computational methodology to study these very important issues, and you can bring in your own skills and knowledge to this field of social science to improve our lives. So I hope that at least today's discussion will lay the foundation for that, and looking forward to more of the interdisciplinary research coming in here in KAIST as well. Yeah.
I would like to ask a question. We work with Professor Kim, to be frank. What you said
about finding the truth. We really respect that because we're engineers. We develop the tools, but often we're sort of we don't care too much about the truth. But as scientists, you do. And so sometimes it's a little bit, we get a little afraid of this, right? Because the questions you ask are so much more touching the lives of everyday people. And usually when we do computer science research, our research is very far from having direct impact on people. So my question, I know you're a quantitative methodologist, but a lot of political scientists are they also afraid of this, or are they embracing it? Are you getting closer to the truth by having this unique methodological viewpoint? And right, so a bunch of questions about that.
Okay. Are you asking whether quantitative methodology will be better or useful for reaching to the truth or scientific truth? The short answer probably I would say would be no. I employ various computational and quantitative methods, but I also am a strong believer of the qualitative method. I was trained as actually a qualitative social scientist as I started my career as a social scientist. Even a couple of days ago, a couple of weeks ago, what I was doing is I was conducting a qualitative research by having interviews with the policymakers, with lobbyists, I studied multinational firms, global production. So I was also interviewing one of the heads in multinational corporations to really understand what's going on. The reason why I think that this qualitative research, in this case, the qualitative research method, in social science, it is called the process tracing. You trace the process of how each individual decision has been made. Because as a social scientist, we really don't live in the world of asymptopia, where n goes to infinity. We don't observe, there is a lot of big data, right? But for the society, if there's a decision for Korean War, then we really don't, observe the infinite number of such, cases where people are randomly drawn from some sort of distribution and then make a decision about whether to go for a war or not. It really is driven by a particular historical, environment where the countries were in, and the players, the main decision makers at that time who happened to make the decisions. And therefore, as a social scientists who are looking for the truth, why there is a war, why there was a Korean War, we really cannot observe the data and then make any scientific conclusion out of that. So I value, for especially the social science research, it is important to combine the qualitative as well as the quantitative method. And these research that I presented today, although I presented the quantitative work that the reason why I motivated today's talk with the two examples about the specific bill is that it's important to look at the data. And it's important to talk to them if possible, which I think will help us to be closer truth, rather than just looking at the data, which sometimes can be a very dangerous, by ignoring some interesting patterns that we don't observe as a human being or the computer cannot observe. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so this wraps up the very first inaugural of the AI+X Forum. Our next forum will invite speakers from various axes, including art, medicine, sociology, and etc. If you would like to participate more, please look for our announcements and please let us know how you can contribute. And Thank you so much for all the speakers, and thank you, the audience, for the wonderful questions. Thank you.